The Washington Territory rain drummed against the cabin roof like stones when Jonas Eriksson heard the woman crying through the forest. It was October 1875, and he had been working alone in these timber-dark mountains for 6 years, cutting Douglas fir and cedar with methodical precision while avoiding the complications that came with human contact. At 34, Jonas had learned that questions led to answers he often preferred not to know, that silence was safer than curiosity, that a man could live peacefully in the wilderness as long as he minded his own business and expected others to do the same. But the sound that reached him through the rain was not the controlled grief of someone mourning in private. It was the raw, desperate sobbing of a person whose world had just collapsed completely, and even Jonas, with his carefully cultivated indifference to others' troubles, could not ignore it. He set down his axe and followed the sound through the dripping evergreens, his heavy boots squelching in the mud and fallen leaves. The crying grew louder as he approached a small clearing where a ramshackle wagon sat tilted on one broken wheel, its canvas cover torn and flapping in the wind like a wounded bird. Beside the wagon, a young woman knelt in the mud next to what was obviously a fresh grave, her hands pressed to the mounded earth as if she could hold the dead man beneath it through sheer force of will. She was perhaps 22, with dark hair plastered to her head by the rain, and a dress that had once been blue, but was now stained with mud and what looked like blood. Even through her obvious distress, Jonas could see the unmistakable curve of pregnancy beneath her soaked clothing. She was far along, maybe 7 or 8 months, and her sobs were punctuated by the kind of gasping breaths that suggested she was on the edge of complete collapse. Jonas stood at the edge of the clearing for several minutes, watching the woman grieve over the crude grave that had obviously been dug with her own hands. The earth was loose and uneven, the work of someone who had never buried a body before, who had done what needed doing despite having no idea how to do it properly. The practical part of Jonas's mind catalogued what he could see: a dead horse tangled in the wagon traces, supplies scattered across the clearing, and the woman's obvious exhaustion. Whatever had happened here, she was alone now, pregnant, and clearly incapable of taking care of herself in the unforgiving wilderness of the Washington Mountains. The sensible thing would be to turn around and walk away, to pretend he had never seen this scene of private tragedy. Jonas had no obligation to help strangers, especially strangers whose circumstances might involve complications he was not prepared to handle. Instead, he found himself stepping into the clearing. The woman looked up when she heard his approach, her face streaked with tears and mud, her green eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from being completely vulnerable in a hostile world. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I do not have anything to steal." "I buried it all with him." Jonas stopped several feet away, his hands visible and empty, his voice gentle when he spoke. "I am not here to rob you," he said quietly. "I heard crying, thought someone might need help." The woman studied his face, taking in his weathered features, the kindness in his eyes that 6 years of solitude had not entirely erased. She was shivering from cold and shock, her lips blue despite the fact that it was not yet truly winter. "Help," she repeated, as if the word were foreign to her. Jonas looked at the scene again, noting details he had missed before. The grave was shallow, barely deep enough to protect the body from scavengers. The woman's hands were raw and bleeding from digging with inadequate tools. She had done the best she could, but her best was not going to be enough. "The grave needs to be deeper," Jonas said simply, "and you need to get warm before you catch pneumonia." The woman stared at him with something between gratitude and suspicion. "Why would you help me?" It was a fair question, and Jonas considered it seriously before answering. Why was he willing to involve himself in this woman's tragedy when he had spent 6 years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement? "Because it is the right thing to do," he said finally. Jonas walked to his cabin and returned with proper tools: a shovel, a pickaxe, and a tarp to keep the rain off while he worked. He also brought a thick wool blanket, which he wrapped around the woman's shoulders without asking permission. "What was his name?" Jonas asked as he began deepening the grave. "Thomas," the woman replied quietly. "Thomas McKay. He was my husband." Jonas nodded and continued digging, not pressing for details about how Thomas McKay had died or what had brought them to this remote valley. The work was hard in the rain-soaked earth. But Jonas had spent years building the kind of strength that made such labor manageable. As he worked, the woman gradually began to talk, sharing fragments of her story in the disconnected way of someone still in shock. Her name was Margaret McKay, she told him. She and Thomas had been traveling from Oregon to Washington Territory, hoping to claim land and start a farm before their baby was born. They had been following an old Indian trail through the mountains when their wagon wheel broke and their horse had injured itself trying to pull the load over rough terrain. Thomas had been trying to repair the wheel when something went wrong. Margaret's voice broke when she reached this part of the story, and Jonas did not push her for details. Whatever had killed Thomas McKay, it had left his wife alone and pregnant in the wilderness, with winter approaching. "I tried to dig deep enough," Margaret said, watching Jonas work. "But the ground was so hard, and I only had a pot lid to dig with." "You did fine," Jonas said without looking up. "You did what needed doing with what you had." When the grave was properly deep, Jonas carefully lowered Thomas McKay's body to its final resting place. The dead man was young, probably not much older than his wife, with the calloused hands of someone who had worked hard for a living. Whatever had killed him had been quick. There were no signs of violence or prolonged suffering. Jonas filled the grave properly, packing the earth tight and mounding it high enough to account for settling. When he finished, he marked the site with a simple wooden cross made from broken wagon planks, carving Thomas McKay's name and the date into the wood with his knife. "There," Jonas said quietly. "He will rest well here." Margaret stared at the completed grave, tears streaming down her face again, but these seemed to be tears of relief rather than despair. "Thank you," she whispered. "I could not bear the thought of leaving him in a shallow grave for the animals to find." Jonas gathered his tools and looked at Margaret, who was still shivering despite the blanket. She clearly could not stay in the wilderness alone, especially not in her condition, but the nearest settlement was 3 days' hard travel through mountain terrain that would be treacherous for a pregnant woman. "You cannot stay here," Jonas said gently. "I know," Margaret replied, "but I cannot leave him either." Jonas understood the conflict. Leaving meant abandoning her husband's grave to the wilderness, but staying meant certain death for both her and her unborn child. "Come to my cabin," Jonas said finally. "It is warm and dry. You can rest there while we figure out what comes next." Margaret looked at him with surprise. "I could not impose on your kindness." "You are not imposing," Jonas said. "You are accepting help that is freely offered." The walk to Jonas's cabin took 20 minutes through dense forest that opened finally onto a clearing where a solid log structure sat surrounded by neat stacks of cut timber. The cabin was larger than Margaret had expected, with a stone chimney that promised warmth and windows that spoke of a man who valued light, even in the deep woods. Inside, the cabin was sparse but clean, furnished with handmade furniture that showed skill and care in its construction. Jonas immediately set about building up the fire in the stone fireplace, adding wood until the flames cast warmth throughout the main room. "Sit," Jonas said, pointing to a chair near the fire. "You need to get warm." Margaret settled into the chair gratefully, holding her hands out to the flames, and feeling life slowly return to her chilled body. Jonas moved efficiently around the cabin, preparing hot coffee and a simple meal of beans and cornbread. "When is the baby due?" Jonas asked as he worked. "Soon," Margaret said, her hand moving automatically to her belly. Thomas thought maybe another month. Jonas nodded, making mental calculations about timing and options. A month meant Margaret would likely give birth before spring travel became feasible again. She would need care during her confinement, and the baby would need time to grow strong enough for a long journey. "You can stay here through the winter," Jonas said quietly. "The cabin is large enough, and I have supplies to last until spring." Margaret stared at him in amazement. "You would do that? Take in a stranger for months?" "You are not a stranger anymore," Jonas said simply. "You are someone who needs help." Over the following days, Margaret gradually settled into life at the cabin while she processed her grief and adjusted to her dramatically changed circumstances. Jonas proved to be a thoughtful and respectful host, giving her the privacy she needed while ensuring she had everything required for her comfort and health. He slept in the loft, leaving Margaret the main bedroom, and he maintained careful boundaries that made it clear he expected nothing from her beyond the simple courtesy of shared living space. When she offered to help with cooking and cleaning, He accepted gracefully but made it clear that her primary responsibility was to rest and prepare for the baby's arrival. "You do not have to take care of me," Margaret said one evening as she watched Jonas prepare dinner. "I am not an invalid." "I know," Jonas replied, "but you are carrying a child, and you have been through a terrible shock. Rest is not laziness, it is necessity." As October turned to November, and the first snows dusted the mountain peaks, Margaret began to share more of her story with Jonas. She and Thomas had been married for 2 years, had tried to build a life on a small farm in Oregon that had failed when drought destroyed their crops. The move to Washington Territory had been their last hope for a fresh start, a chance to claim good land and create the life they had dreamed of when they married. Now that dream was buried with Thomas in the mountain clearing, and Margaret was left to figure out how to build a future she had never imagined having to face alone. "What will you do when the baby comes?" Jonas asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "I do not know," Margaret admitted. "I have no family, no money, nowhere to go. Thomas was everything to me." Jonas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "There are options," he said finally. "What kind of options?" "You could stay here," Jonas said carefully. "Not temporarily, but permanently. Help me run the timber operation. Raise your child in the mountains." Margaret looked at him with surprise. "You would want that?" "I have been alone here for 6 years," Jonas said honestly. "I'd convinced myself that solitude was what I wanted. But having you here has reminded me what it feels like to have a home instead of just a place to sleep." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I am not proposing marriage or anything you might not want. I am simply offering a partnership, a way for you to have security while your child grows up in clean air and open country." Margaret was quiet for several minutes, considering his offer. The practical advantages were obvious. Jonas's cabin was comfortable and well situated. His timber business was successful enough to support a family, and he had proven himself to be both trustworthy and kind. More than that, she had found a peace in these mountains that she had never experienced before, a sense of belonging to the land that helped ease the grief of losing Thomas. "What would people say?" she asked finally. "A widow living with an unmarried man?" "There are no people here to say anything," Jonas pointed out. "The nearest neighbor is 15 miles away, and he minds his own business the same way I do." "And if the baby is not yours?" "The baby will be yours," Jonas said firmly. "That is all that matters to me." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the simple acceptance in his words. "You would raise another man's child as your own?" "I would raise a child who needs a father," Jonas corrected. "Where that child came from matters less than where he or she is going." Margaret's labor began on a cold December morning when snow was falling steadily outside the cabin windows. Jonas had prepared as well as he could, consulting medical books he had ordered from Seattle and laying in supplies recommended by the one doctor he had been able to consult during a rare trip to town. The labor was long and difficult, complicated by Margaret's grief and the isolation that meant they had only each other to rely on. Jonas stayed with her throughout, offering what comfort and assistance he could, holding her hands during the worst contractions and encouraging her when she seemed ready to give up. When the baby finally arrived, a perfect daughter with dark hair like her mother and strong lungs that announced her determination to survive, Jonas felt something shift permanently in his chest. This child was not his by blood, but she was his by choice, by the commitment he had made to protect and care for Margaret and whatever family she brought with her. "She is beautiful," Jonas said softly, cleaning the baby and wrapping her in soft blankets he had prepared. Margaret held her daughter close, tears of joy and exhaustion streaming down her face. Thomas would have loved her so much. "He does love her," Jonas said gently. "Love does not end with death." They named the baby Rose, partly for the hope she represented, and partly because Margaret said Thomas had always talked about planting roses around their future home. Jonas carved a cradle from cedar wood, smooth and strong, and spent hours in the evenings telling Rose stories while Margaret rested. As winter deepened and the cabin became their complete world, the three of them settled into rhythms that felt surprisingly natural. Jonas worked during the day, cutting and preparing timber for spring shipment, while Margaret cared for Rose and managed the household tasks that kept them comfortable and well-fed. In the evenings, they sat by the fire and talked about everything and nothing, sharing stories of their pasts and dreams for the future. Jonas learned about Margaret's childhood in Missouri, her courtship with Thomas, her hopes for the life they had planned to build together. Margaret learned about Jonas's past in Norway, his immigration to America as a young man, his years learning the timber trade before striking out on his own in the Washington Mountains. She discovered that beneath his quiet exterior was a man of deep feeling and strong principles, someone who had chosen solitude not from misanthropy, but from a desire to avoid the complications and disappointments that seem to follow human relationships. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked one evening as she nursed Rose by the firelight. "Taking us in, changing your whole life for strangers?" Jonas looked at Rose's tiny face, peaceful in her mother's arms, then at Margaret, whose presence had transformed his cabin from a shelter into a home. "No," he said simply. "This feels right in a way my life never did before." Spring came early to the mountains that year, bringing with it the return of possibilities and choices that winter had held in suspension. The snow melted from the lower elevations, rivers ran full with snowmelt, and the forest began to show the first green signs of new growth. With spring came also the arrival of other people in their isolated valley, trappers passing through, prospectors seeking their fortunes in the mountain streams, and eventually a circuit preacher who stopped at the cabin seeking shelter for the night. Reverend Williams was a kind man with gentle eyes and an understanding of frontier life that came from years of ministering to people living on the edge of civilization. When he saw Margaret with Rose and noticed the careful way Jonas cared for both of them, he drew his own conclusions about their relationship. "You have a beautiful family," Reverend Williams said to Jonas as they sat on the cabin porch after dinner. "They are not my family by blood," Jonas said honestly, "but they are my family by choice." The Reverend studied Jonas's face, seeing the love and commitment there, despite the unconventional nature of their arrangement. "The Bible speaks often of families formed by choice rather than birth," Reverend Williams said thoughtfully. "Ruth and Naomi, for instance. Sometimes the strongest bonds are those we choose to forge." The conversation that followed was gentle but direct. Reverend Williams explained that while their current arrangement was working well in isolation, Margaret and Rose would face social difficulties if they ever needed to interact with the broader community. "Not that I judge you," the Reverend was quick to clarify, "but others might not be as understanding of your situation." Jonas and Margaret discussed the issue privately that evening, weighing their options and their feelings with the careful honesty they had developed over the long winter months. "I do not want you to feel pressured," Jonas said to Margaret. "Marriage should be about love and commitment, not social convenience." "And what if it is about both?" Margaret asked quietly. "What if I have come to love you for who you are, not just for what you have done for Rose and me?" Jonas felt his heart skip at her words. Over the months they had lived together, he had developed feelings for Margaret that went far beyond simple protectiveness or companionship. She was intelligent, kind, resilient in ways that inspired him, and beautiful in the natural way of someone who was comfortable with herself and her place in the world. "Are you saying you would want to marry me?" Jonas asked carefully. "I am saying I cannot imagine building a life anywhere else with anyone else," Margaret replied. "You have been more of a father to Rose in 6 months than many men are to their own children in years. You have been more of a partner to me than I dared hope for after losing Thomas." She paused, looking out at the mountains that had become home. "I loved Thomas deeply, and I will always carry that love with me. But I believe it is possible to love again, differently, but just as truly. I believe Thomas would want Rose and me to have the security and happiness you offer." They were married 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony conducted by Reverend Williams, with Rose in Margaret's arms and the mountain wilderness as their cathedral. Jonas had carved wedding rings from mountain cedar, simple bands that symbolized the natural, uncomplicated love they had found together. As years passed, their family grew in unexpected ways. Jonas legally adopted Rose, giving her his name and his complete devotion. 2 more children followed, a son named Thomas, in honor of Margaret's first husband, and another daughter they called Grace, for the unexpected blessing their family had become. The timber business prospered as the region developed, allowing them to build a larger house and establish a small settlement that attracted other families seeking the kind of life they had created. Jonas became known throughout the territory as a man of absolute integrity, someone whose word was his bond, and whose help could be counted on by anyone in genuine need. Margaret became the unofficial midwife and healer for their growing community, using skills she had learned from necessity and compassion she had developed through her own experiences of loss and recovery. She never forgot Thomas or the love they had shared, but she built a new life with Jonas that honored both her past and her present. Rose grew up knowing she was adopted, but never feeling less loved because of it. Jonas told her stories about her father, Thomas, ensuring that she understood her heritage while making it clear that love made families, not blood. When she was old enough, Jonas took her to visit Thomas's grave, maintaining it as carefully as if the dead man had been his own brother. One evening, 20 years after that rain-soaked day when Jonas had found Margaret crying over her husband's grave, they sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching their grandchildren play in the yard. Rose had married a local rancher and lived nearby with her family, while Thomas and Grace had chosen to continue the family timber business. "Do you ever think about how different our lives would have been if you had not heard me crying that day?" Margaret asked Jonas. Jonas considered the question, looking out at the thriving homestead they had built together, at the family that had grown from a single act of compassion. "I think about how close I came to walking away," he admitted. "I almost convinced myself it was not my business, that I should not get involved." "What changed your mind?" Jonas smiled, remembering the younger man he had been, so afraid of human complications that he had nearly missed the greatest blessing of his life. "I realized that some things are more important than minding your own business," he said. "Sometimes you have to risk getting involved if you want to discover what really matters." Margaret reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of 2 decades together. "Thomas would have liked you," she said softly. "He would have been grateful that Rose grew up with such a father." "I hope so," Jonas replied. "I tried to be the man he would have wanted raising his daughter." As night fell over the Washington Mountains, Jonas Eriksson reflected on the journey that had brought him from lonely lumberjack to patriarch of a thriving family. It had started with a simple decision to bury a stranger's husband without asking questions, to offer help without expecting anything in return. That decision had taught him that the complications he had spent years avoiding were actually the connections that made life worth living. Margaret and Rose had not disrupted his peaceful solitude. They had shown him that peace without love was just another form of emptiness. The lonely lumberjack who had buried the pregnant girl's husband had discovered that sometimes the most important questions were the ones you never asked, and that the most meaningful answers came not from words, but from actions that spoke louder than any explanation ever could.